I still remember the moment my daughter said the words that shattered something inside me. I had just told her I needed surgery and a few weeks to recover. Her response was cold, quick, and final. If I could not help her anymore, then maybe I should not come back into their routine at all. In that instant, decades of sacrifice felt like they had been erased. I sat there holding the phone, wondering how a lifetime of love could suddenly feel like an inconvenience. That was the moment everything changed. Because sometimes the deepest betrayal does not come from strangers. It comes from the family you gave everything to. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Holloway, and I am 72 years old. I live alone in a quiet wooden house on a shaded street in Charleston, South Carolina. The house is not large or impressive, but it holds the better part of my life inside its walls. I moved here more than 40 years ago with my husband, Thomas, when Charleston was still the kind of place where neighbors knew one another and children rode their bicycles until the streetlights came on. Our street runs beneath a row of old oak trees that stretch their branches across the road like gentle arches. In the summer, the air carries the smell of salt drifting from the harbor. In autumn, the leaves fall slowly across the sidewalks, and the whole neighborhood seems to move at a calmer pace. I have always loved this house, not because of how it looks, but because of what it has witnessed. Thomas and I raised our daughter Rachel here. Every room carries a memory. The kitchen still reminds me of rushed school mornings when Rachel would sit at the table half awake while Thomas read the newspaper. The living room once held birthday parties, holiday dinners, and the loud laughter that only families seem able to create. Thomas passed away 12 years ago after a sudden heart attack. One ordinary morning, he was sitting in his favorite chair with a cup of coffee, and by evening the chair was empty in a way that changed the entire rhythm of the house. Losing him felt like losing the foundation beneath my feet. For months afterward, I moved through the rooms quietly, unsure how to exist in a space that had once been shared. After Thomas died, I made a quiet decision that I never spoke aloud. I would keep my family close no matter what it required from me. Rachel was already grown by then, building a life of her own. She eventually married a man named Daniel Carter, and a few years later they had a daughter, Lily. When Rachel decided to open a clothing boutique in downtown Charleston, I used a portion of the savings Thomas and I had built over decades to help her start the business. I never thought of it as a sacrifice. It felt natural to help my child stand on her own feet. As Lily grew older, my days slowly began to revolve around her schedule. I picked her up from school most afternoons and drove her to piano lessons or art classes. Sometimes I stayed with her until Rachel finished closing the store in the evening. Those hours became a steady part of my routine, filling the quiet space Thomas had left behind. Rachel often told me that the family could not manage without my help. I remember hearing those words many times over the years. Each time they made me feel useful and appreciated, as though I still had an important place in the center of my daughter's life. Looking back now, I realized that I never counted the time or the money I gave. I never measured how often I rearranged my own life to fit the needs of theirs. Helping them simply felt like the natural extension of being a mother. Still, over time, something began to change in ways that were difficult to notice at first. Family dinners became less frequent. Rachel's phone calls often came only when she needed help with Lily or advice about the business. Invitations to spend time together without a purpose quietly disappeared. For a long time, I ignored those small signals. It was easier to believe that everyone was simply busy with their lives. I told myself that families grow and change, and that love does not always look the same as the years pass. One quiet evening, I sat alone in the living room as the last light of the day filtered through the curtains. The walls around me were covered in framed photographs. Rachel smiling in her wedding dress, Lily as a toddler holding a seashell at the beach, holidays when the table had been full and the house alive with voices. I studied those photographs carefully, noticing how still they looked now compared to the life they once represented. In that quiet moment, a thought slipped into my mind that I had avoided for years. Sometimes the difference between being loved and being needed is much larger than we want to admit. If you're still watching, and this beginning made you curious about what really happened between a mother and her daughter, comment number 1 below so I know you're here with me. Now, let's move on to chapter 2, where one phone call begins to change everything. The pain in my right knee did not arrive suddenly. It crept into my life slowly, the way winter creeps into Charleston. At first, it was nothing more than a stiffness when I stood up from my chair. I told myself it was normal for someone my age. 72 is not young, after all. A little soreness in the joints seemed like a fair price for the years I had lived. For a long time, I ignored it. Every afternoon, I still drove across town to pick up Lily from school. The drive took about 15 minutes if the traffic lights were kind. Lily would climb into the passenger seat with her backpack sliding off one shoulder and begin telling me stories about her day before I had even started the engine. Those drives were often the brightest part of my afternoon. After school, I usually took her to one activity or another. Some days, it was piano lessons in a small brick building near the waterfront. Other days, it was an art class where she spent an hour painting bright shapes and animals that rarely looked like anything in the real world. I waited in the car or in the hallway during those lessons, stretching my knees slowly and hoping the dull ache would fade. It never did. Standing in the kitchen for too long began to feel like balancing on a loose hinge. Climbing the porch steps required holding the railing more carefully than before. Still, I kept moving through my routines because stopping would mean admitting that something was wrong. One morning in early autumn, I walked out to the mailbox at the end of the driveway. It was a simple task I had done thousands of times before. When I turned back toward the house, my knee suddenly locked with a sharp burst of pain that made me stop in the middle of the yard. For a moment, I could not move at all. I stood there beneath the oak trees, gripping the stack of letters in my hand and staring at the front door as though it were much farther away than usual. When the pain eased enough for me to walk again, I moved slowly up the porch steps and sat down in the chair beside the door. That was the moment I realized I could not pretend any longer. A few days later, I visited an orthopedic doctor in Charleston. The waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and polished floors. After examining my knee and studying the scans, the doctor explained that the joint had deteriorated significantly. The cartilage was nearly gone. If I wanted to walk without constant pain, knee replacement surgery would eventually be necessary. He spoke calmly, as doctors often do when describing something life-changing. The surgery itself was routine, he said. The recovery would take patience. I would need several weeks of rest and physical therapy afterward. Driving and standing for long periods would be difficult during that time. I listened carefully, nodding as he explained the details. By the time I left the office, the decision felt unavoidable. That evening, I sat in my living room with the phone in my hand. Rachel needed to know about the surgery because it would interrupt the routines we had built over the years. I assumed she would understand. After all, health problems are part of life. When she answered, I could hear the faint noise of the boutique behind her, hangers sliding across metal racks, a distant conversation with a customer. I told her what the doctor had said and explained that I would need surgery. There was a pause on the line, longer than I expected. Instead of asking about the procedure, Rachel began asking about Lily's schedule. Who would pick her up from school? Who would drive her to piano lessons? Who would stay with her until the store closed in the evening? I explained as gently as I could that I would need time to recover. I would not be able to handle those responsibilities for several weeks. Another silence followed. Then Rachel spoke in a tone I had never heard from her before. If you cannot help us after surgery, Mom, then do not expect to come back into our routine. The words hung in the air for a moment before the call ended. I sat in my chair long after the line went quiet, the phone still resting in my hand. Outside, the wind moved softly through the oak branches, and the house felt larger and emptier than it had only minutes before. For years, I had believed that helping my family kept us close. That night, for the first time, I wondered what would happen if I stopped. If you're still watching, and that moment felt as heavy to you as it did to me, comment number 2 below to let me know you're following the story. Now let's continue into chapter 3, where the truth starts to reveal itself in the quietest way. The morning of my surgery arrived before the sun had fully risen over Charleston. I woke earlier than usual, long before the neighborhood began to stir. For a few moments, I remained in bed, listening to the quiet hum of the ceiling fan and the distant sound of a passing car somewhere down the street. The house felt unusually still that morning. I moved carefully through my routine, aware of the stiffness in my knee with every step. Packing my small hospital bag did not take long. A pair of comfortable clothes, a book I suspected I would not read, and the reading glasses I used every evening. The bag looked too small for something that felt so significant. For a brief moment, I found myself glancing at the front door, as if I expected it to open. It did not. Rachel had explained earlier in the week that the boutique was extremely busy and that leaving work during the day would be difficult. I told myself that adults have responsibilities and that businesses do not pause for medical appointments. Still, the quiet absence of anyone else in the house made the morning feel heavier than I had anticipated. A transportation service arranged by the hospital arrived shortly after sunrise. The driver helped place my small bag in the back seat and asked politely how far the hospital was from my home. I gave directions while watching the familiar streets pass slowly by the window. Charleston looked peaceful that morning. Shops were just beginning to open, and the sidewalks were nearly empty. The oak trees along the roads cast long shadows across the pavement. I had driven these streets thousands of times over the years, often on my way to pick up Lily from school. Seeing them now from the back seat of someone else's car felt strangely distant. The hospital building rose ahead of us in quiet gray stone. Inside, the process moved quickly and efficiently. A nurse guided me through registration, handed me a clipboard of forms, and then led me into a preparation room where I changed into a hospital gown. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and polished floors. Patients were being prepared for surgery in neighboring spaces separated by curtains. Some spoke softly with family members sitting beside them. I could hear low conversations, the occasional nervous laugh, the quiet reassurance of someone holding a loved one's hand. I realized that I was the only person there without a visitor. The thought lingered in my mind, but I pushed it aside. The nurses were kind and professional, explaining each step of the process with calm voices that carried the confidence of routine. Before they wheeled me toward the operating room, I checked my phone. There were no messages. The operating lights were bright and unfamiliar, but the medical staff moved with practiced ease. A nurse adjusted the blanket around my shoulders, while the anesthesiologist explained that I would begin to feel sleepy soon. The last thing I remember clearly was the soft beeping of a monitor somewhere nearby. When I woke, the world felt distant and slightly blurred. My knee was wrapped in thick bandages, and a dull ache pulsed through my leg as the anesthesia slowly faded. The recovery room was quiet except for the steady rhythm of machines and the distant footsteps of hospital staff moving through the hallway. I turned my head slowly, expecting to see someone sitting beside the bed. The chair next to me was empty. Later that afternoon, I reached for my phone on the tray beside me. A single message had arrived from Rachel. She wrote that she hoped the surgery went well and mentioned that the store had been busy that day. The message was brief and polite, the kind someone might send out of obligation rather than concern. I read it several times before setting the phone back down. An hour later, another notification appeared. This one was from Lily. Her message was simple, asking if I was feeling better. The kindness in those few words warmed something in my chest that had felt cold all day. I replied slowly, telling her that I was resting and would be stronger soon. As evening settled over the hospital, the lights dimmed and the hallway outside grew quieter. I lay awake staring at the pale ceiling above me. Pain from the surgery pulsed steadily through my leg, but another realization pressed even deeper. For many years, I had believed that being needed meant being loved. That night, lying alone in that quiet hospital room, I began to wonder if those two things had never truly been the same. If you're still watching and wondering how someone faces a moment like that completely alone, comment number 3 below, so I know you're still with me. Now let's move on to chapter 4, where reflection begins to turn into something much deeper. The morning after my surgery began slowly, as if time itself had grown heavier overnight. When I opened my eyes, pale light from the hospital window stretched across the floor in thin stripes. For a moment, I could not remember where I was. Then the dull pressure in my knee reminded me. The bandages were thick and tight around the joint. When I tried to move my leg, a sharp ache traveled upward, stopping me immediately. A nurse came in not long afterward, her voice calm and practiced as she checked the monitors beside the bed. She asked a few routine questions about the pain and adjusted the medication in my intravenous line. Hospitals have a strange rhythm. People come and go in quiet waves, yet the hours themselves seem to stand still. Later that morning, a physical therapist visited my room. He explained that recovery would take patience and that walking again would happen in small steps. With his help, I sat up at the edge of the bed for the first time since the operation. Even that simple movement felt like climbing a hill. After he left, the room returned to silence. I reached for my phone on the small tray beside the bed. The screen lit up quickly, but there were no new messages. I stared at the empty notifications for a moment longer than I meant to. It was easy to imagine Rachel moving quickly around her boutique, answering customers and arranging displays. The store had always demanded her full attention, especially during busy seasons. Still, the quiet absence of even a brief check-in lingered in the room like an unanswered question. The hours passed slowly. Nurses came in to check my blood pressure, to bring water, and to remind me to rest. Between those visits, I lay awake with nothing to distract me except my own thoughts. When there is nowhere else to look, the mind begins wandering through old memories. I began thinking about the years after Thomas died. Those early months had felt uncertain and hollow. Helping Rachel with her boutique had given me something to focus on. I remembered writing the first large check to help her lease the store space downtown. At the time, it felt like an investment in her future. Over the years, the help continued in smaller ways. Sometimes, it was money to cover a shipment that arrived late. Sometimes it was paying for Lily's piano lessons or a summer art program. Other times, it was simply stepping in so Rachel could work longer hours while I watched Lily. I had never questioned any of it. Helping had become part of my routine, just like morning coffee or evening walks through the neighborhood. The requests rarely felt unreasonable on their own. Only now, lying in that quiet hospital room, did I begin seeing them lined up beside one another like pieces of a puzzle. By early afternoon, my phone finally vibrated. Rachel had sent a message asking how I was feeling. The note was short and quickly followed by a comment about how crowded the store had been that day. I read the message twice before setting the phone down again. A little later, another notification appeared. This time it was Lily. Her message asked if my knee was getting better. The words were simple and sincere, and they carried more warmth than anything I had felt all day. I typed a careful reply, telling her that I was resting and that the doctors expected me to recover with time. When evening came, the hallway outside my room grew quieter. The soft sounds of the hospital faded until only the steady hum of machines remained. I opened the notes application on my phone and began writing a small list. At first, it was only a few lines. The monthly transfer that helped cover Lily's lessons, the payments that occasionally supported Rachel's boutique when business slowed, other responsibilities that had quietly become part of my life. Seeing them written down felt strangely different than simply remembering them. The list was longer than I expected. I placed the phone back on the table and rested my head against the pillow, staring at the ceiling as the room dimmed for the night. For the first time in many years, I allowed myself to imagine a life where every decision did not revolve around someone else's needs. The thought did not frighten me. If anything, it felt like the beginning of something I had forgotten how to consider: my own life. If you're still watching and starting to see the bigger picture behind these years of sacrifice, comment number 4 below to let me know you're here. Now, let's continue into Chapter 5, where the story begins to uncover something far more serious. I returned home 4 days after the surgery. The medical transport van stopped in front of my house just before noon. The driver helped me step carefully onto the sidewalk while I balanced my weight on a walker the hospital had sent with me. Even the short distance from the curb to the front porch felt longer than I remembered. The house looked exactly the same as it had when I left. The oak trees still stretched their branches over the street. The white railing along the porch still needed fresh paint. A small pile of leaves had gathered in the corner near the steps. Nothing outside had changed. Inside, however, something felt different. The living room carried the faint scent of furniture polish and old wood. Sunlight slipped through the curtains and rested across the sofa. I lowered myself slowly into my armchair and sat quietly for a few minutes, letting the familiar surroundings settle around me. For years, my days had been filled with movement: driving Lily to school, running errands for Rachel, stopping by the boutique to help with small tasks when the store was busy. Now the house felt still. And in that stillness, my thoughts finally had space to unfold. Later that afternoon, I remembered the list I had started in the hospital. The notes application on my phone still held the first few lines I had written in that quiet recovery room. I pushed myself carefully to my feet and walked down the hallway toward the small desk where I kept my financial papers. The bottom drawer held a folder filled with old bank statements and receipts I had saved over the years. I carried the folder back to the living room and opened it slowly. At first, I simply flipped through the pages: transfers from my account to Rachel's, checks written for various expenses, receipts from the early days of the boutique. One by one, the pieces began to form a picture I had never fully examined. I found the original check I had written when Rachel first decided to open her clothing store downtown. At the time, the amount had seemed large, but I told myself it was an investment in her dream. Further back in the folder were statements showing months when I had quietly covered part of the store's rent during slow seasons. There were payments for renovations, for new inventory shipments, and once even for a replacement air conditioning unit during a particularly hot summer. Mixed among those larger expenses were smaller, regular transfers: money for Lily's piano lessons, money for art classes, occasional help with household bills when Rachel mentioned that business had been difficult that month. I took a blank sheet of paper from the desk and began writing down the amounts. When I finished adding the numbers together, I sat very still. The total was more than $90,000. For years, I had given that money without hesitation. I had never considered it a burden because I believed I was helping my family remain stable. But seeing the number written clearly on the page made something shift in my mind. I turned another page in the folder and paused. Tucked between two bank statements was a document I did not remember seeing before. It was a photocopy of paperwork connected to a business loan for Rachel's boutique. My eyes moved slowly across the printed lines until they reached a section labeled Guarantor. My name appeared there. Margaret Holloway. I read the page again, more carefully this time. The document suggested that if the boutique failed to repay the loan, the responsibility could pass to the person listed as guarantor, to me. A cold weight settled in my chest. I did not remember signing any agreement like this. I sat at the kitchen table long after the afternoon light began to fade, reviewing the paperwork again and again. Each line confirmed the same unsettling possibility. Rachel had placed my name on that loan. The quiet of the house pressed in around me as the realization took hold. For the first time, the help I had given so freely no longer felt generous. It felt dangerous. That evening, I placed the papers neatly back into the folder and closed the drawer. There was only one sensible step left. If I wanted to understand exactly what this meant, I needed to speak with a lawyer. The morning after I discovered the loan document began with a restless kind of quiet. I woke earlier than usual, long before the sun had fully risen over the rooftops of Charleston. The house was still dark, the only light coming from the small lamp beside my chair in the living room. The folder containing the papers sat on the coffee table where I had left it the night before. For several minutes, I simply looked at it. Part of me wanted to close the folder again and pretend I had never found the document. Life would have been simpler that way. But the uneasy weight in my chest told me that ignoring the problem would not make it disappear. I made coffee slowly, leaning carefully against the kitchen counter to ease the pressure on my recovering knee. The smell filled the room with a familiar warmth that usually brought comfort. That morning it only sharpened my thoughts. There was one person who might help me understand what I had found. Robert Gaines had been the lawyer who helped Thomas and me draft our will many years earlier. I had not spoken to him in a long time, but I remembered him as a careful and patient man who explained complicated matters in ways that ordinary people could understand. After breakfast, I found his office number and placed the call. The receptionist answered with a warm, professional voice. When I gave my name, she paused briefly before saying that Mr. Gaines still remembered our family. She offered an appointment later that afternoon. By early afternoon, I was driving slowly through the familiar streets of Charleston. The city looked much the same as it always had. Tourists wandered along the sidewalks, and the harbor breeze carried the scent of salt through the open car window. Robert's office occupied the second floor of an old brick building near the historic district. The interior still had the polished wooden floors and tall windows I remembered from years earlier. Robert greeted me in the reception area with the quiet kindness that had always been his manner. Time had added gray to his hair, but his voice and steady presence remained unchanged. We sat across from each other in his office while I placed the folder of documents on his desk. I explained everything as clearly as I could: the years of helping Rachel start and maintain her boutique, the money I had contributed without ever keeping track, and finally the loan document that listed my name as guarantor. Robert read the page slowly, his eyes moving across each line with careful attention. When he finished, he rested the paper on the desk and folded his hands for a moment. He explained that a guarantor agreement meant exactly what it sounded like. If the business failed to repay the loan, the responsibility could fall to the person whose name appeared on the document. In this case, that person was me. Hearing the explanation spoken aloud made the situation feel more real than it had the night before. I told him that I did not remember signing anything like that. Robert nodded thoughtfully and said that the next step would be to request the full loan records to confirm exactly how my name had been included. The conversation then turned toward my broader financial situation. Robert asked when I had last updated my will. I realized that it had not changed since shortly after Thomas passed away. At the time, I had assumed everything would naturally pass to Rachel one day. Now that assumption felt far less certain. Robert explained that reviewing my estate plan could help ensure my finances were protected and organized according to my current wishes. By the time our meeting ended, I felt a strange mixture of relief and clarity. Nothing about the situation was simple, but for the first time I was no longer facing it alone. When I stepped back onto the Charleston sidewalk, the afternoon sunlight felt warmer than it had earlier that day. The future still held many questions, but I had finally begun asking the right ones. If you're still watching and want to see what happens when someone finally decides to stand up for themselves, comment number 6 below, so I know you're still here with me. Now, let's move forward into Chapter 7, where the consequences start to unfold. The days following my meeting with Robert Gaines moved at a slower pace than the life I had lived before the surgery. Recovery from the operation required patience, and patience was something I had never practiced very well. Each morning began with careful movements. I rose from my bed slowly, steadying myself before placing weight on my recovering knee. The walker beside the bed had become a quiet companion, guiding me through the familiar rooms of the house in a way that felt both humbling and necessary. The physical therapist had given me a list of exercises to complete every day. They were simple movements, but each one required focus and determination. I performed them near the living room window, where the morning light warmed the floorboards. Without the usual rush of errands and responsibilities, the hours stretched wider than they had in years. I no longer drove across town every afternoon. I was not arranging Lily's lessons or stopping by Rachel's boutique to help with small tasks. For the first time in a long while, the rhythm of my day belonged entirely to me. At first, the quiet felt unfamiliar. Gradually, it began to feel like space. A few days after my visit with the lawyer, my phone vibrated with a message from Rachel. The words were brief and practical. She asked how my knee was healing and mentioned that managing the boutique had been difficult without extra help. I read the message slowly. There was no mention of the surgery itself or the pain that had followed. Instead, the note focused on how complicated her schedule had become while balancing work and Lily's activities. I placed the phone on the table without answering immediately. Later that afternoon, an email arrived from Rachel that was longer than her usual messages. She described the past weeks as overwhelming. Running the boutique and keeping up with Lily's school events had apparently become far more stressful than she expected. The tone of the message suggested that my absence had created a burden for the entire household. I read the email twice. Not once did it mention how I was feeling or how recovery might be going. I closed the message and set the phone aside. The realization that followed was quiet, but unmistakable. Rachel seemed to see my surgery not as a hardship for me, but as an inconvenience for her. As evening approached, another message appeared on my phone. This time it was from Lily. She asked if my knee was getting stronger and wondered if she might be able to visit when I felt better. The kindness in those few lines softened something in my chest that had tightened earlier in the day. I wrote back slowly, telling her that recovery was taking time, but that I looked forward to seeing her soon. After dinner, I stepped carefully onto the front porch and sat in the wooden chair Thomas and I had once shared on warm evenings. The sun was lowering behind the row of oak trees, casting long shadows across the quiet street. Cars passed occasionally, and somewhere down the block a dog barked lazily. For years, my life had been built around responding to someone else's needs. The silence now surrounding me felt different from the loneliness I had feared. It felt steady. For the first time in many years, I sensed that peace might exist in a life where I was no longer constantly trying to hold everything together for everyone else. Several days passed after the quiet evening on my porch. Recovery continued slowly, but I could feel small improvements in my strength. The walker had been replaced by a cane, and although every step still required care, the movement felt a little more natural than before. One calm afternoon, I stood in the kitchen preparing tea. The kettle had just begun to whistle when I heard a soft knock on the front door. Visitors had become rare enough that the sound caught my attention immediately. When I opened the door, I found Lily standing on the porch with her bicycle leaning against the railing. A small backpack hung from one shoulder, and her sketchbook was tucked under her arm. Seeing her there brought an unexpected warmth into the quiet house. She stepped inside cautiously, as if unsure whether she was interrupting something important. The moment she crossed the threshold, the stillness of the house seemed to lift. I prepared a small plate of crackers and fruit while she spread her drawings across the kitchen table. The pages were filled with bright colors and imaginative shapes. Some of the pictures showed animals that looked like they had stepped out of a dream. Others were landscapes with tall trees and houses beneath wide skies. Watching her explain each drawing reminded me of the afternoons we once spent together before my surgery. Back then, the house had been filled with the sound of her stories and laughter. She asked gentle questions about my knee and whether the exercises were helping. Her curiosity was simple and sincere, the kind that comes from someone who truly wants to understand. As we talked, I noticed a moment of hesitation when the conversation drifted toward her parents. Lily explained that her mother had been very busy at the boutique lately and that evenings at home had felt tense. After a brief pause, she mentioned something she had overheard during a conversation between Rachel and Daniel. According to Lily, they had been discussing financial problems connected to the store. At one point, they talked about how selling my house one day could help solve those difficulties. The words were spoken innocently, without any understanding of their weight. I listened quietly and nodded, careful not to let my reaction show. Lily returned to describing one of her drawings, unaware that her comment had settled heavily in my thoughts. Later, we looked through an old photo album in the living room. Pictures of Rachel as a child made Lily laugh at the hairstyles and clothes from another time. The moment felt warm and genuine in a way that reminded me how uncomplicated love can be. When Lily finally prepared to leave, I walked her to the porch and watched as she rode her bicycle down the street beneath the arching oak trees. After she disappeared around the corner, the house grew quiet again. I returned to my desk and opened the folder of financial papers. This time, I was not searching for answers about the past. I was preparing to protect the future. If you're still watching and you can feel that the story is building towards something important, comment number 8 below to let me know you're still with me. Now, let's move toward the final chapters and the true ending of this story. A few days after Lily's visit, my recovery had progressed enough that walking through the house felt steadier. The cane still supported most of my weight, but each step required less effort than before. The quiet routine of my days had settled into something calm and predictable. One afternoon, my phone vibrated on the table beside my chair. The message came from Rachel. She explained that she and Daniel needed to travel out of town for several days because of a business matter connected to the boutique. At the end of the message, she asked if Lily could stay with me during that time. I read the words carefully. The tone of the message was casual, almost as if the difficult weeks between us had never happened. There was no mention of the conversation before my surgery or the distance that had grown since then. It sounded like the same practical request I had answered countless times before. For a long moment, I sat quietly with the phone in my hand. In the past, I would have replied immediately. Helping Rachel had always felt like the easiest way to keep peace in the family, but now the situation felt different. I thought about the paperwork I had discovered, the conversation with Robert Gaines, and the quiet warning hidden inside Lily's innocent story about her parents discussing my house. After a few minutes, I wrote my reply. I told Rachel that Lily would always be welcome in my home. Spending time with my granddaughter was never a burden to me, but I also explained that my help should not be treated as something guaranteed. The message was brief and respectful, yet the meaning behind it was clear. Later that evening, Lily called. She sounded relieved when she learned she would be staying with me for a few days. Hearing the excitement in her voice brought a small smile to my face. The next morning, she arrived with a small suitcase and a book tucked under her arm. Rachel remained in the car at the curb and did not step out. Lily ran up the porch steps and hugged me carefully. Over the following days, the house filled again with quiet laughter, drawings spread across the kitchen table, and the simple rhythm of shared meals. Helping Lily no longer felt like an obligation. For the first time in years, it felt like a choice. The final morning of Lily's visit arrived quietly. I woke before sunrise, the house still wrapped in the gentle stillness that comes before the day begins. For a moment, I remained in bed listening to the soft hum of the ceiling fan and the distant sound of a car passing along the street outside. My knee felt stronger than it had only weeks earlier. With the help of my cane, I walked slowly into the kitchen and began preparing breakfast. The familiar routine felt comforting in a way that was difficult to explain. Soon Lily wandered into the kitchen, her hair still slightly tangled from sleep. We sat together at the table while the morning light moved slowly across the floor. She talked about school, about a drawing she wanted to finish, and about a story her teacher had read to the class. Listening to her reminded me of Rachel at the same age, before life had grown complicated. After breakfast, Lily packed her small suitcase and waited by the door. A car pulled up outside and I knew Rachel had arrived. Lily hugged me carefully, mindful of my knee. I held her for a moment longer than usual before letting go. She walked down the porch steps and climbed into the car. I remained standing on the porch as the car disappeared down the street. The house grew quiet again. Later that afternoon, I sat at my desk with a blank notebook open in front of me. For years, I believed my purpose was measured by how much I gave to others. Now I understood something different. This was not the story of a woman who had been pushed aside. It was the story of a woman who had finally remembered how to stand on her own. Stories like this remind us that love and sacrifice are not the same thing. For many years, people are taught that caring for others means giving endlessly, even when it slowly empties the heart. But true dignity begins the moment someone remembers that their life has value beyond the roles they perform. Boundaries are not acts of cruelty. They are quiet acts of self-respect. Sometimes the bravest decision is not fighting louder, but choosing peace, clarity, and the courage to live with an open heart while still protecting what matters. When someone learns to stand firmly in their own life, they rediscover something simple and powerful. Respect for oneself creates the space where real love can exist. If this story moved you or reminded you of someone in your own life, thank you for being here. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to follow and subscribe so you never miss the next story.